Okay, Isaac, shall we?
All right, let's do it. This is very exciting. I'm glad to be here with you all again. I just want to welcome everyone. I'm Isaac Shub, and on behalf of the New Haven Free Public Library, welcome to another installment in Yale Public Humanities Democracy in America series. I always look forward to the privilege of being involved in these talks. And as a library worker, I'm especially interested in discussions about disinformation. And so I hope you enjoyed tonight's talk, and I'll turn things over to Professor Matthew Jacobson to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome everyone, it's great to see you here. It feels like winter in New Haven, although the sky is clear and it's quite beautiful and the promise of spring is in the air. Let me start with a couple of thank yous. Thanks to our partners in the New Haven Free Public Library. This is a really important partnership to us. It's meant a lot over the years. Thanks especially to Delaney Kelly, Seth Godfrey, Marianne Huggins, Luis Chavez Bromell, Rory Martirana, and Isaac Shub, who you just met. Thanks too to my colleague in Public Humanities, Karen Rothman, who's done so much for this series and for Public Humanities in general, and our associate Jake Gagne, who is working even now behind the scenes on the back end of this webinar. Thanks, Jake. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Joshua Glick. Josh Glick took his PhD here at Yale, and he's currently the Isabelle Peregrin Assistant Professor of English, Film and Media Studies at Hendrix College. And he's also a fellow at the Open Documentary Lab at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Glick's research and teaching explore global documentary, critical race studies, television, early cinema, emerging media, and Hollywood as an evolving form of industrial and artistic production. His articles have appeared in such journals as Film History, Jump Cut, Film Quarterly, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Moving Image, and the Historical Journal of Film, Radio, and Television. His book, Los Angeles Documentary and the Production of Public History, was selected as a finalist for the Richard Wall Memorial Award from the Theater Library Association. And he's currently writing a book that examines how the post-1989 rise of neoliberalism and the seismic shifts in the media industries galvanized an interest in documentary on both the left and the right of the political spectrum. As documentary proliferated across new platforms and was put to use by a range of social movements, it came to occupy an increasingly contested space in the public sphere, ultimately transforming the relationship between Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and Washington, D.C. Glick served as the film and media curator and produced the award-winning documentary, This Side of Dreamland, for the NEH-funded exhibition, Coney Island, Visions of an American Dreamland. In collaboration with colleagues at MIT, he recently designed the interactive digital humanities curriculum, Media Literacy in the Age of Deep Fakes. The project teaches students and educators about the past and present of disinformation, the rise of deepfake videos, as well as the civic uses of synthetic media. Finally, Dr. Glick is currently co-curating the exhibition at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York City, Deepfake, Unstable Evidence on Screen. And this is what we'll be hearing about tonight. So welcome, Josh Glick. It's great to see you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you to Jake, to Isaac, to Professor Matthew Jacobson for making tonight possible, and to Yale Public Humanities, and also to the New Haven Free Public Library, great partners. And it's really an honor to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You can see a messy desktop for a quick second. Set the timer. Great. And so tonight's presentation, about a 20-minute presentation, Democracy in the Age of Deepfakes and Disinformation. I'll talk about a number of things then. We're gonna, myself and Professor Matt Jacobson are gonna be sort of in dialogue, and then we're gonna open it up for more of a public discussion. So I really see a lot of the work that I do in film and media studies as the public humanities. This involves a lot of public-facing projects. You just heard about a couple of them. This interactive module that I did, it's open access, media literacy in the age of deepfakes, really designed for students. The white paper that I co-wrote with the human rights group witness, as well as a co-creation studio at MIT on the relationship between deepfakes and satire. This is also open and available to read. And then most recently, deepfake unstable evidence on screen, up right now at the Museum of the Moving Image, and just a frame grab of the website and then some of the interior views of this exhibition. And I'll be drawing from this material, from these three projects, in what I talk about tonight and what we talk about as a group. Just very quickly for the presentation right now, I'm going to go over a couple of terms and concepts. We'll talk about threats and consequences for malicious deepfakes. We'll also think about synthetic media for the civic good and some sort of pro-social uses of this technology. So for our short presentation, this is where we're headed. First off, some of you may be familiar with what a deepfake is, what it looks like, what it sounds like. We'll just hear a couple seconds of one more in the kind of vein of the civic good, but just to sort of familiarize us with some of this technology. So we'll just hear a couple seconds of this brief clip, this Obama PSA, and then we'll break down some definitions. Just want to make sure everybody can hear this. Hold on, wait 1 second. Great, okay.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or...
All right, just a couple seconds of the use of that technology, right? So when we think about deepfakes, we're thinking about a combination of deep learning and fake, right? This mashup is where we get this term. It refers to media that uses artificial intelligence to simulate somebody doing or saying things they never did or said, or appearing in fabricated situations without their consent, right? What we just saw was not, in fact, Barack Obama, but a simulation of the image of Barack Obama with Jordan Peele doing the sort of voice, mimicking the voice for this example. A lot of malicious deepfakes are part of a broader field of disinformation. And when we think of disinformation, we're thinking of information that is explicitly circulated with the intention to deceive, and often with economic or political gain, not always, but often. Deepfakes are also a form of synthetic media. I've used that term a couple of times so far, which is really media that is enabled or modified in some ways by AI. And it's important to say that this broad category of disinformation in our public sphere, it's really nothing new. So while there's a lot of, say, alarmist headlines that we might have seen in the past couple of years about deepfakes leading to a kind of information apocalypse, or something coming out of nowhere, or something just totally radically fresh and new. Yes, deepfakes are distinct and to some degree new, but disinformation is in fact very old. Media manipulation is very old, right? And just to look at a couple very brief examples to get into the long history of media manipulation and disinformation, right? We could look to the early 1830s, the Great Moon Hoax, articles appearing about man-bats on the moon. It had a real effect to boost circulation, to give rise to the penny press within the US. It was really an elaborate hoax and caused great stir and debate. Or for a more targeted and malicious example, we can think of various forms of photo manipulation, right? Joseph Stalin's erasure of history. And this would have to do with literally sort of scratching, sort of hand etching individuals out of images, out of the official historical record, out of documents once they fell out of favor with the administration. Stalin wasn't unique in this kind of photo manipulation, but we could say was a pioneer in this way of trying to fabricate, trying to alter the past as a way of controlling, stabilizing the present, and helping to realize a certain vision of the future. So these are just a couple examples. We could think of, conspiracy theory films. We could think of various forms of sensationalized tabloid TV. We can think of many different forms of media manipulation and disinformation. But during the long 2010s, we really see a kind of intensification and expansion of disinformation, right, during this period. And I would say that, along with a number of my colleagues, have sort of looked to this period as seeing a number of forces really coming together, right? Advances in deep learning tech, for sure, access to big data, but also social media platforms, rising around 2005, 2006, resulting in not just in filter bubbles, but really privileging, really pushing in terms of their algorithms, various forms of disinformation, sensational news kinds of articles and images that really pull at your heartstrings and push your emotions. This is the kind of thing that, for a lot of social media in its initial years, still to this day, has really been emphasized. Also, the deregulation of the media industries. It's an era of consolidation, of mega mergers, of really a lack of control or limitations placed on a lot of how these institutions operate, and then a crisis in contemporary journalism, right? A lot of journalistic entities really looking for new models of sustainability, and this resulting in a lack of counterbalance and a lack of challenge from credible media sources to a lot of the disinformation we see. We could also add to these four factors, the rise of the right-wing media ecology, right-wing extremism. Trump is part of that, and as a lot of scholars have been researching, right, disinformation really sort of thrives much more so in the right-wing media ecology and these right-wing media institutions. And today, thinking about our contemporary disinformation ecosystem, there are some, say, legacy forms of technology, put to use for various forms of disinformation, right? Sometimes referred to as cheap fakes or shallow fakes, right? Speeding up or slowing down footage of something, right? Making Democratic Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, making it sound like her words are slurred as if she was drunk. Just the effect of slowing down speech. Or speeding up footage, right? Making CNN White House correspondent Jim Acosta look like he's performing an aggressive action, right? By speeding up the footage. So this, isn't involving AI technology. This is sort of using a lot of legacy technologies, devices, software, things like that, but can have a quite powerful effect. We could also think of things like just recontextualizing, creating new captions for footage. Renaming something can have a powerful effect depending on how it's circulated and picked up, right? But if we're thinking about deepfakes in particular, as an emerging cultural form, it really sort of rose within Reddit. In late 2017, an anonymous Redditor who went by the handle Deepfake started a discussion forum by the same name, which was devoted to videos featuring the faces of Hollywood actresses on the bodies of adult film stars, right? So non-consensual deepfake pornography was really swirling in Reddit and these more fringe areas of the internet, but quickly rose. This was a pretty striking statistic done in the early years of deepfakes in the late 2010s. By Sensity, a sort of threat assessment organization, saying that a lot of, significant, most of the deepfakes out there in these early years were non-consensual deepfake pornography, 99% of which targets women. Some stats for deepfakes on the rise, right, in the sort of late 2010 period, a real rapid rise. It's harder to track just in the past year or two for just how many deepfakes are out there, and what form. It's significantly more than the amount we're seeing here, but this is all to say that it's really accelerated in the late 2010s and into the 2020s. As far as threats and thinking about malicious deepfakes and the kinds of harm that they can cause, right? They shame, discredit, demean individuals. They can undermine the credibility of journalists just by the fact of their existence, and also undermining the credibility of reputable media outlets. They can heighten social divisions, and they can also offer a way for public figures to avoid responsibility. I just want to sort of dwell on this point for a second. As scholars Robert Chesney, Danielle Citron have talked about, they give a way for figures in power to say, oh, this thing didn't happen. It's a deep fake, right? And just thinking about the possibility of that kind of claim or that kind of argument going forward, it could really allow for significant figures to just avoid accountability and responsibility, right? Just by claiming whatever happens that is going against maybe a position they are holding or an idea they have, just for that thing to be a deep fake. And the flip side of that would potentially be the ability of these figures to fabricate, right, deep fakes and pass them off as real, right? We haven't seen, just in terms of civil society or in major elections, a case of say a malicious deep fake just taking somebody down and really altering the course of an election in dramatic fashion. But we've seen a number of cases of deep fakes, the debate, I should say, surrounding deep fakes, having a presence or an impact in politics, right? The idea that deep fakes exist and they have this potential, they have this power, right? So in Gabon, President Ali Bongo, who was ill, he wasn't appearing in public, and gave a New Year's address in a video, and he looked quite stilted in the video, very unnatural sort of speech. People suspected that it might have been a deep fake, right? That he was deceiving the public. It led to attempted coup. The researchers have found that the video itself, he might have had some plastic surgery, some Botox. It was a poorly made video. It was probably not a deep fake, but it's hotly debated. And for a case of perhaps not a malicious deep fake, but nonetheless one that's deceptive, Manoj Tiwari of the BJP party in an election in India was sort of using this technology to allow him to speak to a wider voter base by speaking multiple languages, some of which he did not speak, right? But this idea that this technology would allow somebody to present, synthetic versions of themselves to constituents, to a larger public, and people have debated, the ethics surrounding this. As far as combating the possible threats of deepfakes, we talk about digital media literacy. I'm just checking my time. This could lead to various forms of close reading, right? We're already at the point where, very sort of slick, well-crafted deepfakes are beyond the point of just easy detection, right? There are good deepfakes out there. We cannot tell if they're in fact fabricated or are authentic or the real thing. However, there are some tells for more poorly made deepfakes, right? So we can see, right, in this deepfake Elon Musk right here, we'll watch a couple seconds of it and have some arrows pointing to things to look out for.
Then have a nice.
Trying to connect to our conference.
Okay, who is it?
I don't know. 1 second.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Are you Elon Musk?
Yes. It looks like I got into the wrong conference in Zoom. How are you doing, guys?
Good.
Right. So this is not Elon Musk. And so we can see, too much glare or glow on the skin, infrequent blinking or no blinking at all. Cheeks and forehead appear too smooth or wrinkly, even some unnatural motion in that sort of point of connection between the head and neck, right? Poorly made deepfakes look like this, and there are some tells. But we could also think, and this is just equipping students, everyday citizens, for how to think about deepfakes and deepfake detection, that looking beyond the image, close reading beyond the video itself to the broader context, doing some contextual sleuthing. Things like, does the video have an author? Is it appearing in a reputable news site? Who sent it? Can it be cross-referenced to do some assessment as to whether it's true or not, right? Thinking about the close reading of the context is also absolutely crucial. And beyond what individuals can do, we can think about, policy as a place to weigh in on regulating this technology. We can think about content moderation and how major social media platforms, should be held more accountable and responsible for how they detect malicious forms of deepfakes on their platforms. These are things beyond what individuals can do and more at a societal level, what can be done. But there are also, and for the last 4 minutes or so, I want to point towards some alternative uses of synthetic media, right? That it's all not necessarily malicious deepfakes, right? That the same AI technology can be used for a variety of purposes, right? Some for play and parody, right? Cage fakes is a very popular subgenre of face swapping, right? Nicolas Cage surfacing in a wide variety of Hollywood films. If you're interested in Nicolas Cage, I suggest you check it out. Hollywood storytelling, right? We're in the age of de-aging, and there's all kinds of possibilities for creating, synthetic characters or synthetic voices, images, synthetic characters as well in Hollywood films. There's also civic uses of AI, right? Handsome David Beckham appearing in a campaign to fight malaria and speaking many languages, right? To make a mass appeal to viewers as part of an advocacy campaign. A project I've been involved with, an inventive moon disaster, presents a counterfactual history of the 1969 Apollo 11 moon landing. Encouraging viewers to think critically about how we construct narratives of the past and how we understand our current information ecosystem, right? It presents the moon landing as a failure and a deepfake Nixon reading a contingency speech that he had prepared, his administration had prepared in case the mission itself had failed. So this is presented in an installation context, and an important component of this installation is a reveal segment where we explain how this video was made, how this technology was used, and we sort of contextualize it in a broader space of synthetic media, right? Synthetic resurrection, people do debate about the use and applications of these kinds of technologies, right? Bringing people who are deceased back to life, perhaps for a good cause. So in this case, Joaquin Oliver, a victim of the mass shooting in Parkland, Florida, appears in a video to promote gun control legislation. His parents appear in the video as well. There is a disclaimer, to prevent any form of confusion as to what we're seeing, right? His family's sort of on board with this effort. But still, people sort of debate the ethics surrounding things like synthetic resurrection as many different applications. Film like Welcome to Chechnya, where AI technology was used to protect the faces of subjects that appear in this film. It's about the LGBTQ community in Chechnya, how they're repressed and how there's a sort of network set up to get individual members out. This sort of deep fake technology for the civic good in this context allows individuals to have their faces protected, but also allows them to emote, to express themselves. And there is what's called, some after blur between their head and neck to sort of signal to the viewer that their faces have in fact been altered. This is coming from deep within meme culture. Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh, dancing to Bat Out of the Hell. It's a form of a sort of incendiary satire, and satire is a very large realm of synthetic media. And then also Sassy Justice, right, by the creators of South Park, poking fun at local news, but also sort of major figures in power, Al Gore, Donald Trump, Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner. It also serves as a kind of educational series about deepfake technology. We can maybe just see a brief moment of it. And this is sort of getting to the end of our presentation. Right here, just maybe the opening seconds.
You're watching Channel 9, Cheyenne, Wyoming.
The times they are a-changin'.
Here in Cheyenne, scammers are finding new ways to take advantage of you, the consumer. Now, with a technology called deepfake,
You can get screwed over and lied to in ways never before possible. Hi, I'm Fred Sassy. Today we'll dive into the world of deepfakes. Plus, is a local Cheyenne dialysis clinic charging too much for dialysis? All this and more right now on an all-new Sassy Justice.
I'm gonna rotate that and then almost done, just rounding it out. Hold on, wait 1 second. Rotate to the next slide, hold on. One second. I just want to end with a couple notes on the road ahead. What it looks like in the present and future. A lot of my colleagues, we see the real threat as being, disinformation in terms of cheap fakes and shallow fakes, right? Just those sort of legacy forms of speeding something up, slowing it down, recontextualizing it. This is having the greatest impact rather than deep fakes, especially as there are new sort of extreme right-wing platforms, Gab and Rumble and Getter and Parler, Donald Trump's own Truth Social. It has not been doing too well as a platform that he launched, has an insanely long waiting list just to get registered for it. But these are the places in which disinformation will be thriving in coming months. And then also just the last gesture towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that deep fakes have surfaced in this context, right? Ukrainian government had been warning, had been preparing the world that a deep fake of Zelensky was likely. One did appear on, Russian hackers created one. It was on Ukraine 24 on a television station, and then on the website, made it onto some Russian social media platforms. But Ukraine was prepared, quickly sort of labeled it as fake. Zelensky issued a direct response to it, right? The deepfake had said, encourage people to lay down their weapons, trying to, create some sort of impression of a resistance effort that was failing, and Zelensky directly countered that. And so we see this playing out in the Russian invasion. We might see more deepfakes to come. Absolutely, certainly disinformation is thriving, and we can see almost an alternative media ecosystem within Russia at this point. And just one last slide for a place where there's a lot of really great work happening on the synthetic media front. I encourage people to check out the initiative Synthetic Futures. They have a lot of convenings and panels and events. It brings technologists, artists, civil society folks together to think about the present and future of synthetic media. And it's a really great organization to learn about. So with that, I'm at about 23, so I'll stop right there.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I mean, this is, for the uninitiated, it's a fascinating and very frightening world that you're describing. I have a feeling we're going to end up focusing more on the present and the future as our discussion moves forward. But historian over here, I want to go backward. I want to touch on two things that you've already brought up, but just go in maybe a little more detail. One is, you mentioned the Stalinist practice of airbrushing people out of photographs once they fell out of favor with the Kremlin. That's probably for most of us, that probably seems much closer to where we are now than that 1830s newspaper moon hoax that you gave us. But can you walk us through maybe just a little more elaborately the history of the technological advances that bring us from that Stalinist airbrushing tactic to where we are now? Are there like turning points or junctures that you would point to in the development of the deepfake?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would go at that question in a couple of different ways. I mean, certainly there's been, advances in things like software, and Photoshop, right? I mean, people point to like an early moment of say the, early 90s as a moment when, Photoshop allowed for, home use, easy manipulation of photographs of images to create, incredibly powerful forms of, disinformation if applied in that way, specifically for things like, photography. And, we could see the rise of just home video technology as potentially having these kinds of applications. And we could also look at or go at that question by way of thinking about what are the kind of institutional shifts, I mean, changes in the media industries that allow things like, disinformation to thrive, to circulate, and I don't think it would be that, out there of a claim to say, as the media industries have become, increasingly deregulated, as, there's less oversight. And I'm not just talking about, less room for fact checkers, and people like that, even though that, that is part of it, but a kind of, 30 plus year slide in terms of, deregulation in the media industries, I think also has contributed to this. A commercialization of the media industries, a play for looks and audiences and consumers, and we can see, even mild to severe forms of things like disinformation, really thriving in tabloid TV news and and things like that, where maybe it's not like Stalinist style face swapping or erasure, but certainly an attempt to sort of bend and push and alter the truth in all kinds of ways that exist in the spaces of talk radio and tabloid TV, coming out of the 70s into the 80s and then onwards to the 90s. I mean, we're at a point right now, I'd say, in a more kind of to historicize the contemporary, that, I mean, so much of this has thrived on social media, and the kind of algorithmic biases for what kinds of stories, what kinds of images, what kinds of things are sort of pushed and have sort of made it into people's news feeds. I mean, I would say that early social media was another inflection point in the early years of a lot of these platforms of Facebook and Twitter and places like that. That if not aiding in the production of this kind of material, really aided in its circulation and how people encountered it, which is a huge part of this, right? I mean, there's one aspect of like, I'm able to create this thing which looks convincing, whether by way of Photoshop or home editing technologies, through iMovie or something like that. But there's a whole nother dimension, which is, look, it's gonna surface in your news feed in a way that is seamless, in a way that's convincing, in a way that can be just taken up and recirculated with such ease and fluidity, right? That there's not going to be necessarily the kinds of stops or checks or at least ways to kind of just pause and have a greater kind of sense of reflection or assessment. So I'd say, yeah, I mean, within recent times, like the 2005, 2006 social media, moment, there's a sort of longer multi-decade sort of shift in the media industries. There's, the rise of Photoshop and things like that. But I just want to end by way of saying, I mean, I don't want to demonize the technology or give a kind of techno-determinist argument to say that, look, like these new technologies are created and like then we get disinformation or it's leading in some ways towards these applications. But certainly with the ease with which a lot of this media can be made and circulated, that is an outcome, just as there's all kinds of civic applications and ways to create photographs and films and news stories for all different kinds of uses.
Yeah. It seems like another piece of this, and it's related to what you just said, is the shift in the media environment. Not just the technologies and not just the deregulation, but also just the proliferation of platforms. And so that, I mean, it seems to me, I wonder what you think of this, that a world that is characterized by 3 networks is much less susceptible to this kind of thing than a world where there are 50,000 cable channels plus the internet. Do you look at it that way or no?
Yeah, I mean, I do in those moments, as I'm trying to sort of like piece together the various overlapping histories and these broader timelines, to try to look at these things historically. I mean, I do think perhaps there were some advantages to sort of past media eras where there was gatekeeping mechanisms or more centralized, and in some cases credible sources of media production and exhibition. I mean, I wouldn't, romanticize or think that the age of 3 networks was like, the glory years of media either,
It was the era of manufactured consent.
Yeah. So it's like, I mean, there are all kinds of ways to critique, that moment, and even, the rise of public media and PBS, seeking to be a kind of mainstream corrective almost to a kind of failure, of the commercial marketplace for, for news and with these commercial networks. But I will say that, yes, I mean, in an era when it seems like, and I'm going to put sort of my teaching hat on for a second, where there's just so many sources of information that people are looking in so many different places, that there's maybe a loss or a confusion surrounding an understanding of where to look for credible news. And this is something I talk a lot about with my students, where I'll say, where do you get your news? Where do you get a source? A lot of them will, the majority will often initially point to some area of social media, some, sort of coming in directly in that fashion. But, thinking through with people about where to look for credible sources of information, I think is absolutely crucial. It can seem like there's not a kind of clear place to go, or there's, I suppose, a way in which people are encouraged to look in a much more diffused fashion, which can be tough, which can be confusing, especially in times of crisis, when it's absolutely critical to have credible sources of information. And, in terms of the moment we're living in, I mean, it can be a matter of life and death.
Yeah. Yeah. Since you mentioned regulation and deregulation, I want to read, this is one of the first comments from the audience. And by the way, I want to encourage our audience members to submit questions. You can either use the chat or you can use the Q&A function, but we'll field as many of these as we can. We'll try to get to them all. But here's one who says, the applications are fascinating. This came up actually while you were talking, while you were showing your slideshow. The applications are fascinating. If I'm honest, I do believe it should be better regulated. Can you talk about what regulation might look like? How do we accomplish that?
Yeah, I mean, good question, big question. I'll also point to some different conversations that I think are happening. There are, I mean, some folks that say that, a lot of these apps, right? I mean, deepfakes can be created at the point of an app at this point, with little to no knowledge of coding, right? I mean, it's like uploading an image, and the ability to manipulate it takes off from there. People saying that this is a problem, right? I mean, putting that kind of power, just open access, there should be greater accountability, greater screening, in terms of who should be able to access this kind of cultural form or this kind of technology, and for what purpose, right? So at the point of registering for these apps or being able to access them, that there'd be some initial screening, something to be done just to prevent its sort of mass uptake. There's also, just on the level of content moderation, on these platforms, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, that there needs to be, there hasn't been enough, and there needs to be a significant, total shift in thinking about their approach to moderating the content, not just for non-consensual deepfake pornography, extreme versions like this, but just for different kinds of deepfakes in general. This needs to come from humans looking at this, not just detection bots, that they need to get more savvy, more involved, to hire for this, to put more money into these kinds of screening processes, and really taking more responsibility for the kind of media that exists on their platforms, rather than, in past years, a lot of these platforms would just basically take the perspective of, they aren't, a media company per se, they're a tech company, right? They're not responsible for a lot of the things that exist on their platforms. A lot of the platforms that I showed towards the very end of that presentation, right? The, Gab and Truth, the Trump's new social media platform as well, are even trying to go into a more kind of libertarian almost, perspective of like no regulation at all, right? I mean, and just a more extremist sense than even a lot of these social media platforms. But this is all to say that regulation can come from, and moderation can come from, the platforms themselves. And then there's, there can be a policy dimension to this, right? I mean, trying to limit malicious deepfakes. California had some laws on the books limiting deepfakes, surrounding election time, or limiting certain kinds of deepfakes as far as applications for candidates, certain kinds of malicious uses.
Were those laws, were those in the nature of deterrence through penalty, or how did what was the traction that those laws were intended to have?
Yeah, I believe so. You know, but I mean, it has been controversial. I mean, a lot of those laws haven't been, you know, widely sort of taken up as you know, a largely sort of adopted, you know, approach to policy on like a national level yet. I mean, you know, in the US, there's, especially in the last, say, 30 years or so, there's been, you know, real difficulty in sort of regulating around, you know, issues of free speech and what can be done by way of synthetic media, or other forms, right? I mean, FCC and FTC has really struggled with this. And I mean, is just taking a look at any number of these mergers and the power of these and cloud of these social media companies has, you know, have been really pushing back against that. So those are just, I mean, some of the different levels of, you know, moderation and regulation on the level of these platforms, what, you know, is being talked about, at least on the level of policy. And then, you know, at a more kind of local level, I mean, in a hyper local level, just how this media, you know, exists in classrooms and communities and, you know, personal relationships that we have to it, you know, as everyday citizens.
Mm-hmm. Here's a great question that just came in that's on a kind of contiguous area. What impact have deepfakes had on conversations about copyright and intellectual property?
Yeah, I mean, a great question. And this is also a debate, right? So, I mean, in general, and I'm not a lawyer, I mean, nor do I play one on TV, but I'll just, I mean, this is something that
you could be made to, actually, through manipulation.
Perhaps, but I mean, and this, you know, comes out in the in that deepfake and satire report. I would encourage people to look into that. There's some interviews with some attorneys and some legal scholars in there. But in a general sense, you know, claims to likeness for, say, a private citizen are different than like a public figure, right? So one of the things that allows, you know, for deepfakes of Trump and the Sassy Justice example that I just showed, right, versus kind of what can be done to an individual, much more can be done in terms of manipulation of these public figures. They are in public, you know, they are talked about, they are debated, whereas you have more claims to privacy and to how I look as a private individual. I mean, there's a lot of interesting discussion that goes on, say, in like the entertainment space, right? I mean, should someone be able to license their likeness, perhaps to ads, to commercial uses, right? You know, maybe an actor would want to do that, right? And have a certain kind of fee for how their image could be manipulated in commercials or for branding or, you know, for all kinds of things. But of course, you know, one could see somebody not wanting to do that, right? And sort of making some claims surrounding, you know, that in fact is not okay, you know, and then it would sort of drill down on the level of, you know, well, if somebody's having their likeness, you know, stolen and used in other contexts, I mean, are those other contexts, you know, profit earning endeavors, right? I mean, is someone sort of making money off their likeness versus, you know, a kind of parody or satire? And there are some exceptions for satire in the legal realm as well. But I think some of the debates, I'd say the entertainment industry is a particularly interesting one, in that, yeah, I mean, there are some arguments for wanting to license likeness, and how that could be a profit generating endeavor, versus wanting to severely limit it. And some artists, I mean, sort of thinking about a kind of almost like a feedback loop between, you know, artists, you know, an artist sort of giving their likeness over to a fan community, them sort of generating, you know, additional content, which could maybe build their brand or help them out. I mean, there are almost like as a kind of conceptual art project, you know, there are some artists, I think, interested in that.
Right. Yeah, great.
Yeah, these are great questions.
Yeah, and there are more great questions rolling in. This is fabulous. Where do you see this technology evolving in the next few years? And are there any software applications available that can identify deepfakes?
Yeah, I mean, so the bigger one, I mean, first, yeah, I mean, it's going to move in different directions, right? I mean, Hollywood, you know, is all about this. I mean, as they are for every turn in technology, right? De-aging, bringing characters back, you know, creating new characters environments, right? I mean, AI can have a large presence, will continue to have a large presence in Hollywood visual effects work, and even, you know, not just to create moments of spectacle and, you know, and awe, but you know, to be really integrated into character construction and narrative. Artists are looking to this technology as well. You know, everything from installation art to the kind of vernacular art making of you know, satire that we're seeing on YouTube, right? And fan videos. I mean, fans have gravitated to all kinds of face swaps, you know, cage fakes just being one example. And then, you know, malicious uses as well. I mean, there hasn't, as I mentioned, you know, in the presentation, you know, there was some thought that, you know, 2020 election was going to be this moment, right, of like, you know, the deep fake moment for, you know, a really targeted strategic deep fake, you know, really derailing aspects of the election process. You know, part of the reason people think that did not happen was just because of the effectiveness of, you know, lower tech legacy forms of disinformation, right? That stuff is pretty effective, right? It's pretty fast, it's easy to make, it's easy to circulate, it has an impact with voters. There is not necessarily, or hasn't, you know, been the need for, you know, the deployment of these kinds of deep fakes yet. But as we, you know, are seeing with things playing out in Ukraine, I mean, you know, they are being tested and used, and, you know, the threat is real. And there is, you know, a bit of a kind of cat and mouse game in terms of like detection software. There's a lot of initiatives out right now to try to think about this area of you know, media forensics, right? And it's more kind of specialty technology, specialty uses, say for journalists, for civil society organizations, to do things like, you know, verify footage, you know, that it is real. There's been a number of articles recently, you know, that have come out about how the Guardian and the New York Times, you know, performs a kind of verification process. You know, just brief shout out to organizations like Witness that have been very active with, you know, thinking about tools, thinking about what journalists need, thinking about what, you know, those folks involved in human rights work need to try to detect, you know, deep fakery or image manipulation at work, and thinking about things like, okay, is there, you know, a watermark that could, you know, be used to sort of verify forms of footage, and, you know, when that is distributed and sent along. I mean, there's probably not going to be the kind of wide scale, you know, uptake of these kinds of technologies just for everyday folks, right? Like when you want to look at an article, to have to like run it through a kind of verification process, but certainly for, you know, for journalists and these folks, it's, you know, it's absolutely important.
Yeah. There's a deep philosophical question sitting in front of me, but I want to just pass over it because what you just said is related to one of the questions that's behind it, and that has to do with, are there ways that terms and conditions of use on platforms like Facebook can be used as part of the regulation of this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, yeah, I think there's.
And has this been tried?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't. I mean, it hasn't been something that a lot of social media companies, right, have, I think, really sort of, you know, foregrounded. I mean, even a lot of mainstream ones. This is not to mention the ones that almost pride themselves on not having those, you know, sort of consent disclosure kinds of forms, right? I mean, some of the platforms that I was mentioning, right, like pride themselves on just like some sort of ultimate form of free speech. But I mean, I think that could have potential that when you are, you know, a member of Facebook or Twitter or, you know, some of these other platforms, that you are consenting to behave, to act, to, you know, engage in a particular way, and to be held accountable. I mean, I think this kind of thing has a lot of potential. There's just a lot of resistance to doing things like that. I mean, in part, it messes with perhaps their business model, but also, you know, involves a kind of not just like a rebrand, but a sort of reconceptualization, I think, of how a lot of these companies sort of see themselves. You know, that would sort of move in the direction of, you know, what it means to create a kind of environment of civil dialogue, of civic discourse on these platforms, rather than, you know, toxic cesspool, which is how a lot of discussion and debate ends up on these places.
Okay, here's the philosophical one.
Okay.
As we shift into a more multipolar geopolitical landscape, i.e. away from the hegemony of Western liberalism or the fantasy thereof, the reality of universal abstractions is coming into question. What is the social relevance of the concept of truth today? What do deepfakes suggest about how people identify, create, and share truths? Is there a deep truth which we can oppose, even hypothetically, to deep fakes?
Yeah, I mean, okay, good question. And I guess I'll speak about that question, around that question, from just a couple of different perspectives. And I mean, I think it points to a couple of things. I mean, one, this idea of, all, representations, all depictions, are altered, are shaped in some way, are subjective, by using words like truth or reality or authenticity. I don't mean to suggest that there's some sort of like pure form of representation out there that is sort of opposed in some way to deep fakes or media manipulation. And Susan Sontag and others have written very eloquently about these kinds of points, right? That there's always degrees of subjectivity, of shaping, of point of view, of perspective, despite what, American journalism sometimes will still sort of brandish terms like objectivity and absolute balance and things like that. However, I think it is important to acknowledge that there are some basic grounds of credibility and truth and facts, and we can sort of have lowercase t truth or lowercase f facts that just allow for the everyday functioning of civil society and democracy to happen and to unfold. And I think the past couple of years, I'm a scholar of documentary and media studies, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about and debating those first set of questions and those first set of points that I mentioned. But I also am thinking about what are the base levels of understanding and the kind of stakes surrounding an agreed upon set of facts and truth that just allow a political election to unfold, or a lot of these civil society institutions to remain intact. And I think there is great importance just surrounding common understanding, shared beliefs, in that sense as well. I know that's probably not a comprehensive or even a kind of nuanced answer maybe to that very philosophical and I think great question, but those are just sort of two ways I sort of engage with it. Like, yes, we can think about perspective, craft, pathways through which every image is always already shaped in some way, and the importance of acknowledging that, but also honoring the reality of people's actual experiences, right? And it's important that we have credible journalism on the ground in Ukraine, to challenge, to counter other kinds of disinformation that are being proposed and circulated elsewhere, in Russia and other places in the world right now.
Yeah. This hour has flown by. We're rapidly running out of time, so this might be the last question, but it's actually a pretty great question to end on. When it comes to the US government, mainly how they get information to the public, how dangerous can this be? Is this, or can it become, a public safety issue? That's the question from the audience. And I will just add to that, how sanguine or optimistic are you that democracy can survive this?
I mean, I'm an optimist. So, I mean, I think I don't know. I don't know if I have to be, but I'm an optimist as far as like the line of work that I do, and being with students, most days a week in a classroom, and working on this, this kind of stuff, because I think while we could very easily continue down a path in this conversation that looks at the the erosion or the corrosion of civil society that that's happening, and this information warfare is really on the front lines of that, and we could look to even credible news sources of the newsrooms are being eaten away by loss of funding, and the counter forces, happening and looking ahead to the next election as being one of, a real site of anxiety. There's all kinds of examples to, I think, really back that up and to make us quite nervous. But at the same time, I think there's just really amazing things happening with this technology, and I mean, everything from just various forms of citizen journalism and vernacular art to whole kind of initiatives being, launched to really bolster, civil society through good journalism, through new forms of media making. And I think really, I'll put a fine point on this, that really interesting points of collaboration, right? I mean, academics coming together with technologists, coming together with communities, I think in new ways, which is really exciting. It's like an all hands on deck moment for democracy, right? So it's, I think, inspiring to see, faith organizations working with universities, working with technologists, to make new forms of media. And it can really bring new purpose, new sense of urgency to institutions like, public libraries or, universities, or, to really reimagine, really reconceptualize what public media, might be. And so, I don't know, I mean, I think those kinds of things give me hope and, real inspiration. So, it's like, I think there's good reason to be critical of just the media we engage with on an everyday basis. This is what I tell my students, to be critical, but not, totally skeptical, I think can have its own, real dangers. And so, because deepfakes exist, the idea that we shouldn't believe anything we see is, I think, a real problem. But being critical,
that's what the authoritarians want, right? Is for us to disbelieve everything.
Yes. Yeah. Let's not do that.
This has been fantastic. And I want to just close out tonight by giving you a chance to plug your projects and your websites, because I think people are just going to be fascinated to log on and see some of what you shared with me earlier in the day.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I can maybe just to everybody, I can, I'm putting in the chat right now, deepfake unstable evidence on screen. This is the this is the exhibition up at the Museum of the Moving Image right now. Media literacy in the age of deepfakes. That's the interactive online module, also open access. Just each one of these projects, I think, is done. And then the last one, just joking. This is the deepfake satire report. I mean, each one of these was just done with really fantastic colleagues, Open Documentary Lab, Center for Advanced Virtuality at MIT, groups like Witness, Co-Creation Studio at MIT, Museum of the Moving Image, Barbara Miller, my co-curator, big shout out to her and everyone at the Museum of the Moving Image for really taking on, an ambitious, kind of show that tries to frame the contemporary and historicize it a bit and also look towards the future. And provide just multiple pathways into this kind of technology for folks that might be super familiar with it or might know very little about it, and to break down some of these concepts and terms. So I just wanted to kind of, and to thank you all. Thank you, Professor Matt Jacobson, Isaac, and Jake, New Haven Free Public Library, as well as Public Humanities Program. So,
thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for the great questions.
Yeah,
amazing questions. Thanks everybody for listening.
It was great. Thanks for coming. We have 2 programs in April to close out the semester. I don't have the dates in front of me, which is my bad. But coming up in a couple of weeks, we have Courtney Martin, who runs the British Art Center, and some of her staff members will be here to talk about the ethics and principles of dealing with slavery in 18th and 19th century American art. And then we'll close out the year. Our friend Jennifer Tucker from up the road at Wesleyan will be here to talk about the Second Amendment and American gun culture. So please join us for those. You can get the specific dates on both the Public Humanities website and also the announcements put out by the New Haven Free Public Library. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. Be careful. Take care of yourselves. And we will see you later in April. And again, Josh Glick, thank you so much for really a brilliant discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone get in touch if you have any questions, but thanks. This has been fantastic.
Great. Thanks. Good night, everyone.